Hello viewers, welcome back to my channel Legal Decipher. In the previous video, we had discussed about Chapter 1 of the Indian Penal Code 1860. If you have not seen that video, you can go and check it. The link is in the description below. In today's video, we are going to talk about Chapter 2 of the Indian Penal Code. We'll go through the chapter and try to understand the substance therein. So if you are new here, please like and subscribe to my channel to get the video notifications. So let's get started. So today we are going to talk about chapter 2 that deals with general explanations. So this chapter basically explains the various terms that are later on used in this code, and for the purposes of better understanding the following sections, we need to first understand what those terms actually mean. Now I have only highlighted those definitions that are important for the purposes of a competitive exam. However, I am going to explain all the definitions, but I will give stress upon those definitions only that are highlighted here. Now let's start with section 6 that talks about definitions in the code to be understood subject to exceptions. It says that throughout this code, every definition of an offence, every penal provision and every illustration of every such definition or penal provision shall be understood. So whatever is written in the following sections will be understood subject to the exceptions that are contained in the chapter entitled as general exceptions. So there is a chapter, that is chapter 4, that talks about general exceptions. So those cases are exceptional cases. Those are some exceptional circumstances in which this code will not take such event as an offense. So we will discuss about that later when we reach chapter 4. For now, let's understand that section 6 says that those offenses that are specifically categorized as general exceptions will be understood as they are exceptions to whatever that is contained throughout this code. Okay. Now, though those exceptions are not repeated in such definitions, it will still be thought as an exception to the rest of the code. Now, section 7 says sense of expression once explained. It says every expression which is explained in any part of this code is used in every part of this code in conformity with the explanation. So whatever is once explained, that will carry out the same meaning throughout the code. Now let's move on to the next section, which is very important, that is gender. Now these highlighted provisions are important because in various competitive exams you can get questions, basically short questions, from these provisions. So you need to understand these sections that are highlighted in a proper sense. So section 8 says gender. It says the pronoun he and its derivatives are used of any person, whether male or female. So whatever may be the gender of the person that we are talking about, whether he may be a male or she may be a female, it doesn't matter. Whenever the pronoun he is used or any derivative of he is used, it will denote both the male and the female. So generally the perception will come to our mind that when it is written as he, then it will only refer to males, but that is not the case in IPC. In IPC, it may be written as he, but you will have to understand that he denotes both a male and a female. Now section 9 says number. It says unless the contrary appears from the context, words importing the singular number include the plural number. So whenever it is written as a singular number, it will also mean that it includes the plural numbers as well. And the words importing the plural number include the singular number. Now section 10 talks about man and woman. This is also very important section. It says that the word man denotes a male human being of any age, and the word woman denotes a female human being of any age. So the age really doesn't matter when we are talking about a man or a woman in IPC. Now if we are to talk about the age, then we will denote that person as a major or a minor. So unless it is specifically said that it is a major or a minor, we will not think it as a major or a minor just by the term man or woman. Now section 11 is also important. It says person. The word person includes any company or association or body of persons, whether incorporated or not. So anyone who is a legal entity will be deemed to be a person in the eyes of law as well as IPC. Section 12 talks about public. The word public includes any class of public or any community. Now section 14 says servant of government. The word servant of government denotes any officer or servant continued, appointed or employed in India by or under the authority of government. So whoever is serving the government is a servant of government. Now section 17 talks about government. It says the word government denotes the central government or the government of a state. So it doesn't matter whether it is a central government or a state government, it will come under the expression government. And section 18 says India means the territory of India excluding the state of Jammu and Kashmir. But as we all know, presently the union territory of Jammu and Ladakh falls within the expression of India according to this code. Now section 19 talks about judge. The word judge denotes not only every person who is officially designated as a judge, but also every person who is empowered by law to give in any legal proceedings, civil or criminal, a definitive judgment. So whoever is entitled or empowered to give a judgment, a definitive judgment in any legal proceedings, whether civil or criminal, which if not appealed against would be definitive, or a judgment which is confirmed by some other authority would be definitive, then that person or those body of persons, whatever may be the case, will be considered as a judge. Now let's move on to the next section, that is section 21, which is a very important section. It talks about public servant. It says the words public servant denote a person falling under any of the descriptions hereinafter provided. So basically section 21 of IPC does not define public servant, it merely enumerates various functionaries who are included in the category of a public servant. There are a list of persons that will fall under the category of public servant. So if we read the entire section, we will get to know or understand which persons will be considered as public servants and who will be not considered as a public servant. So let's understand that every commissioned officer in the military, naval or air forces of India, every judge including any person empowered by law to discharge, whether by himself or as a member of a body of persons, any adjudicatory functions, every officer of a court of justice including a liquidator, receiver or commissioner, whose duty it is as such officer to investigate or report on any matter of law or fact, or to make, authenticate, or to keep, document, or to take charge or dispose of property, or to execute any judicial process, or to administer any oath, or to interpret or to preserve order in the court, and every person specially authorized by a court of justice to perform any of such duties. Also every juryman, assessor or member of a panchayat assisting a court of justice or public servant, and every arbitrator or other person to whom any cause or matter has been referred for decision or report by any court of justice or by any other competent public authority, or every person who holds any office by virtue of which he is empowered to place or keep any person in confinement, or every officer of the government whose duty it is as such officer to prevent offences, to give information of offences, to bring offenders to justice, or to protect the public health, safety or convenience, or every officer whose duty it is as such officer to take, receive, keep or expend any property on behalf of the government, or to make survey, assessment or contract on behalf of the government, or to execute any revenue process, or to investigate or to report on any matter affecting the pecuniary interest of the government, or to make, authenticate or keep any document relating to the pecuniary interest of the government, or to prevent the infraction of any law for the protection of the pecuniary interests of the government. Now, every officer whose duty it is as such officer to take, receive, keep or expend any property, to make any survey or assessment, or to levy any rate or tax for any secular common purposes of any village, town or district, or to make, authenticate or keep any document for the ascertaining of the rights of the people of any village, town or district. And also every person who holds any office in virtue of which he is empowered to prepare, publish, maintain or revise an electoral roll, or to conduct an election or part of an election, or every person in the service or pay of the government, or remunerated by fees or commission of the performance of any public duty by the government, or in the service or pay of a local authority, a corporation established by or under a central, provincial or state act, or a government company as defined in section 617 of the Companies Act 1956. So we need to understand the following people are considered as public servants. Those are an officer in military, naval or air force, a judge, an officer of court of justice, a juror, assessor or member of panchayat, an arbitrator, a person empowered to keep anyone in confinement, a government officer discharging functions in relation to crimes, an officer discharging functions in relation to property matters or documents affecting pecuniary interests of the government, an officer discharging aforesaid functions affecting rights of people in any village, town or district, an officer empowered to act in relation to electoral roll or to conduct elections, any person in service or pay of government discharging public duty, any person in service or pay of local authority, corporation or government company, employees of Life Insurance Corporation of India, employees of State Electricity Board, employees of nationalized banks, chief minister and ministers, municipal commissioners, employees of Indian Railways, employees of Board of Film Censor, employees of public sector undertakings, director State Financial Corporation, sarpanch of a gram panchayat, postmaster of a branch post office, an officer under suspension or a statutory public servant, etc. Now these are the people who will fall under the term public servant. Now we also need to understand those peoples who are not a public servant, who are not considered as a public servant. They are a professor of government college working as examiner in university, a government servant on deputation working with a cooperative society, that is a super bazaar, a security guard in Ashoka Hotel under Indian Tourism Development Corporation, a chartered accountant inquiring into the affairs of an insurance company, an employee of a cooperative society, etc., a municipal councillor, members of parliament and members of legislative assemblies, that is MPs and MLAs, a leader of opposition, insurance surveyor, or an officer who has been dismissed or removed from service, etc. So these are the peoples who are not considered as a public servant. Now the explanation says that the persons falling under any of the above descriptions are public servants, whether appointed by the government or not. Wherever the words public servant occur, they shall be understood of every person who is in actual possession of the situation of a public servant, whatever legal defect there may be in his right to hold that situation. So it does not matter whether his right is facing any legal defect or not. According to that situation, he is a public servant. The word election denotes an election for the purpose of selecting members of any legislative, municipal or any other public authority, or whatever character the method of selection to which is by or under any law prescribed as by election. So we do not need to understand what election is, we already know that. Now let's move on to the next section, which is movable property. It says that the words movable property are intended to include corporeal property of every description except land and things attached to the earth or permanently fastened to anything which is attached to the earth. So basically section 22 defines movable property as inclusive of corporeal property of every description, but land and things attached or permanently fastened to anything that is attached to earth are not considered as movable property. Now corporeal property has physical existence, while incorporeal property has no physical existence. It confers certain rights to the owners. Thus, a tree that is standing on the earth or a land is an immovable property. But when it is severed or separated from the earth, say for example we cut down the tree, then it is a movable property. It becomes a movable property. Now section 23 talks about wrongful gain. It says wrongful gain is gain by unlawful means of property to which the person gaining is not legally entitled. So it means that the person who is gaining is not gaining in a right manner, he is gaining in a wrong manner. Now what is wrongful loss? It says that wrongful loss is the loss by unlawful means of property to which the person losing it is legally entitled. So he was legally entitled to possess that property or hold that property or own that property, but he has somehow lost that property, its possession or its ownership, and that loss was wrongful. That was not supposed to happen legally. So that is a wrongful loss. So gaining wrongfully or losing wrongfully means a person is said to gain wrongfully when such person retains wrongfully. That means he gains that property in a wrongful way, as well as when such person acquires wrongfully. A person is said to lose wrongfully when such person is wrongfully kept out of any property. So he was supposed to be in that property, but he is kept wrongfully out of that property, as well as when such person is wrongfully deprived of that property. So let's move on to the next section, that is section 24. It talks about dishonestly. So whoever does anything with the intention of causing wrongful gain to one person or wrongful loss to another person is said to do that dishonestly. So whenever wrongful gains and wrongful losses are part and parcel of a particular act, then that act would be considered to be done dishonestly. Now let's move on to the next section, that is section 25. It talks about fraudulently. A person is said to do a thing fraudulently if he does that thing with intent to defraud but not otherwise. So when that person has the basic concept of deceiving another person, so his main intention was to deceive another person, then that act out of such deceive will be termed as a fraudulent act. So that act will be fraudulently done. So a person will be considered to be doing an act fraudulently if his intention, his sole intention was to do that to defraud others, that is to deceive others. Now section 26 talks about reasons to believe. It says that a person is said to have reason to believe a thing if he has sufficient cause to believe that thing but not otherwise. So when he has sufficient reasons to believe, then only he will be thought to have reasons to believe. Now section 27 says property in possession of wife, clerk or servant. So when property is in the possession of a person's wife, clerk or servant, on account of that person, it is in that person's possession within the meaning of this code. So the Indian Penal Code considers that when a property is in the possession of a person's wife, clerk or servant, then this Indian Penal Code will think that such property is actually in the possession of that person. Now explanation says that a person employed temporarily or on a particular occasion in the capacity of a clerk or servant is a clerk or servant within the meaning of this section. So it does not matter whether he was temporary or permanent. Even if he was temporarily in employment for a particular occasion as a clerk or a servant to a person, then he will be deemed to be a clerk or servant within the meaning of this section. Now let's move on to the next section, that is section 28. It talks about counterfeit. A person is said to counterfeit who causes one thing to resemble another thing. So basically what he does is that he makes one thing look like or resemble like another thing. So he is not showing the original, he is showing a duplicate, but he is making it look like the original, intending by means of that resemblance. And what does he want to do by resembling the false thing to be the true thing? He intends to practice deception, and he knows it to be likely that such deception will thereby be practiced. So either he himself practices the deception, or he knows that such deception will play a part in that particular act, and he, with such intention, resembles one thing to be another thing. Now explanation says it is not essential to counterfeit that the imitation should be exact. So whether the imitation was exact or not doesn't matter. If he has tried to imitate that particular thing, then he has done the act of counterfeiting. When a person causes one thing to resemble another thing, and the resemblance is such that a person might be deceived thereby, it shall be presumed, until the contrary is proved, that the person so causing the one thing to resemble the other thing intended by means of that resemblance to practice deception, or knew it to be likely that deception would thereby be practiced. So when such person is doing such an act of resemblance of one thing to make it look like another thing, then such person is exercising counterfeit. And if that person may have been deceived by it, then it will be thought to be a perfect act of counterfeiting. Now section 29 talks about document. It says the word document denotes any matter expressed or described upon any substance by means of letters, figures or marks, or by more than one of those means, intended to be used or which may be used as evidence of that matter. So whenever a document is containing any letter, figure or mark, or more than one of those means to express or describe a particular substance, and it is intended to be used or may be used as an evidence, then it is thought to be a document. Now explanation says that it is immaterial by what means or upon what substance the letter, figures or marks are formed, or whether the evidence is intended for or may be used in a court of justice or not. So it doesn't matter really. And explanation 2 says that whatever is expressed by means of letters, figures or marks as explained by mercantile or other usage shall be deemed to be expressed by such letters, figures or marks within the meaning of this section, although the same may not be actually expressed. It basically says that whether a writing expressing the terms of a contract or a check upon a banker or a power of attorney or a map or a plan, all these are considered as documents. Now let's move on to the next section, that is section 29A. It talks about electronic record. So after the enactment of the Information Technology Act of 2000, there is a new term that we are getting is electronic record. So it says that it has the same meanings as it is written in section 2 subsection 1 clause T of that act. Same meaning will be thought to have been exercised in the Indian Penal Code. Now section 30 talks about valuable security. It says that the words valuable security denotes a document which is or purports to be a document whereby any legal right is created, extended, transferred, restricted, extinguished or released, or whereby any person acknowledges that he lies under legal liability or has not a certain legal right. So any document that creates, extends, transfers, restricts, extinguishes or releases any legal right, or whereunder a person acknowledges a legal liability, all those documents are thought to be valuable securities. Now let's move on to the next section, that is section 31. It talks about a will. The words of will donate any testamentary document. So whenever a person dies and before dying he has expressed his wishes that his properties are to be given to some particular person that he has mentioned about in the will, so that document will be a testamentary document and that is a will. Now section 32 says that words referring to acts include illegal omissions. In every part of this code except where a contrary intention appears from the context, words which refer to acts done extend also to illegal omissions. So whether an act was done or something was omitted and that omission was illegal. So words referring to acts will include illegal omissions as per section 32. Now, section 33 talks about act and omission. The word act denotes as well as series of acts as a single act, and the word omission denotes as well a series of omissions as a single omission. So, as we have already read in the previous section, that the words that are used in single sense will also be used in the plural sense. So any act or omission will also mean a single act or omission or a series of act or omission. Now section 34 is a very important section which has practical applications. It talks about common intention. It says acts done by several persons in furtherance of common intention. So what is a common intention? It says when a criminal act is done by several persons in furtherance of the common intention of all, each of such persons is liable for the act in the same manner as if it were done by him alone. So basically it says that when a criminal act is done by several persons, so there are several persons involved in such criminal act, and they have done such act in furtherance of a common intention of all. So all of them were of the same intention, that we will jointly do these acts to achieve a certain thing. Then each of such persons will be liable for that act in the same manner as if it were done by a single person. So they will all be liable to the same extent. Now the object of this section was to recognize the principle of vicarious as well as joint liability that we will read about in criminal jurisprudence. It is an exception to the general rule that every person is liable only for his own acts and not for the acts of other. So generally we have heard about this, that whenever an act is done, the person who is doing such act is only liable for such act. But in case of section 34, it is said that if the intention was common for all of them, then all of them will be liable for any act that was done in furtherance of a common intention. It makes a person liable for the offense that was not actually committed by him, but by another person with whom he had shared some common intention. So their intention was common, but the act was done by someone else, and this person who has not done the actual act but he had shared the common intention will also be jointly liable or vicariously liable under section 34. It is a rule of evidence and does not create a substantive offense. Now let's move on to the next section, that is section 35. It says when such an act is criminal by reason of its being done with a criminal knowledge or intention. So whenever an act which is criminal only by reason of its being done with a criminal knowledge or intention is done by several persons, each of such persons who joins in the act with such knowledge or intention is liable for the act in the same manner as if the act were done by him alone with that knowledge or intention. So section 35 is basically what section 34 is. The only extra ingredient that is added in section 35 is that there should be the knowledge or intention to do such act. If there was similar knowledge or intention, then section 35 will apply. Now section 36 talks about effect caused partly by act and partly by omission. So wherever the causing of a certain effect or an attempt to cause that effect by an act or by an omission is an offense, it is to be understood that the causing of that effect partly by an act and partly by an omission is the same offense. So what does it say? It says that wherever the causing of a certain effect or attempt to cause a particular effect, that means the attempt was to do something or to create a certain effect, and it was done by act or by omission, then it is an offense. And it is to be understood that to cause such effect partly by act and partly by omission is the same offense. So whether he has done something and whether he has omitted to do something, if they form the part of the same offense, then they will be treated as the same offense. Now section 37 says cooperation by doing one of several acts constituting an offense. So when an offense is committed by means of several acts, whoever intentionally cooperates in the commission of that offense by doing any one of those acts, either singly or jointly, with any other person commits that offense. So whenever a person lends a hand, that means he somehow assisted in that particular offense by doing any part of the act, even if he has done it singly or jointly with anyone, that person will be thought to have committed that offense. Now section 38 talks about persons concerned in criminal act may be guilty of different offenses. So where several persons are engaged or concerned in the commission of a criminal act, they may be guilty of different offenses by means of that act. So whenever several persons are engaged or concerned in committing a criminal act, as a result of that they may also be guilty of different offenses by means of that act. Now section 39 talks about voluntarily. It says a person is said to cause an effect voluntarily when he causes it by means whereby he intended to cause it, or by means which at the time of employing those means he knew or had reasons to believe to be likely to cause it. So basically section 39 says that a person is said to cause an effect voluntarily when he caused it intentionally. So if he had the intention to do it, then it is thought to be done voluntarily. Or when he knew or had reasons to believe that it is likely to cause it. Now section 40 talks about offense. It says except in the chapters and sections mentioned in clause 2 and 3 of this section, the word offense denotes a thing made punishable by this code. Now in chapter 4, chapter 5a, and in the following sections, that is 64 to 67, 71, 109, 110, 112, 114 to 120, 187, 194, 195, 203, 211, 213, 214 and 221 to 225, 327 to 331, 347 and 348 and 388, 389 and 445. So all these chapters and sections that are mentioned here, in these chapters or sections, the word offense denotes a thing punishable under this code or under any special or local law as hereinafter defined. And in section 141, 176, 177, 201, 202, 212, 216 and 441, the offense has the same meaning when the thing punishable under the special or local law is punishable under such law with imprisonment for a term of 6 months or upwards, whether with or without fine. So all these sections include the word offense, and that offense denotes a thing that is punishable under this code or under any special or local law with an imprisonment for a term of 6 months or upwards, whether with or without fine. Now section 41 talks about special law. It says that it is a law applicable to a particular subject. So whenever a law is applicable to a particular subject, it is called a special law. And section 42 talks about local law, which says it is a law that is applicable only to a particular part of India. So when a law is not entirely applicable upon the territorial jurisdictions of India, it is applicable to a certain part of India, then it is called a local law. Now, section 43 talks about illegal and legally bound to do. The word illegal is applicable to everything which is an offense or which is prohibited by law or which furnishes ground for a civil action. So any act that is considered as an offense, that is prohibited by law, or that is requiring a civil action against it, all of those acts are illegal. And a person is said to be legally bound to do something whatever it is illegal in him to omit. So whenever a thing is illegal to omit, that means you have to do it, then that thing is supposed to be a legally bound thing. So that person will be legally bound to do that thing. Now section 44 talks about injury. It says the word injury denotes any harm whatever illegally caused to any person in body, mind, reputation or property. So whenever a person is harmed by his body, that means physically, by his mind, that means mentally, by his reputation or by his property. So any injury or harm to all of these things of a person will be termed as an injury under this code. Section 45 talks about life. The word life denotes the life of a human being unless the contrary appears from the context. And section 46 talks about death. The word death denotes that a death of a human being unless the contrary appears from the context. Section 47 talks about animal, which denotes to any living creature other than a human being. And 48 talks about vessel. The word vessel denotes anything that is made for the conveyance by water of human being or of properties. Now section 49 says year and month. It says that whenever the word year or the word month is used, it is understood that the year or the month is to be reckoned according to the British calendar. So it is followed to be a year or month of the British calendar. Now section 50 talks about section. It says word section denotes one of those portions of a chapter of this code which are distinguished by prefixed numeral figures. So whenever there is a prefixed numeral figure, it will be considered as a separate section. Section 51 talks about oath. It says that the word oath includes a solemn affirmation substituted by law for an oath, and any declaration required or authorized by law to be made before a public servant or to be used in the purpose of proof whether in a court of justice or not will be considered as an oath. So oath is basically taken before a public servant, and it is thought to be a solemn affirmation of a person who is making such an oath. So it is basically a declaration that is required or authorized by law to be made for the purpose of proving a certain matter. Now section 52 talks about good faith. It says nothing is said to be done or believed in good faith which is done or believed without due care and attention. So it does not really define good faith. It is just a negative form that declares that nothing can be said to be done or believed in good faith which is done or believed without due care or attention. So in order to establish a good faith, it needs to be shown that such thing was done in due care and with due attention. Then only it will be considered as something that is done in good faith. Now let's move on to the last section of this chapter, that is section 52A, which talks about harbor. It says except in section 157 and in section 130 in the case in which the harbor is given by the wife or husband of the person harbored, the word harbor includes the supplying a person with shelter, food, drink, money, clothes, arms, ammunition or means of conveyance, or the assisting a person by a means whether of the same kind or those enumerated in this section or not to evade apprehension. So say for example a person is evading apprehension. That means some police personnel or other authority is behind that person. They intend to catch that person, to arrest him, and that person is apprehending an arrest and he is evading such arrest. He is evading that apprehension and someone is assisting him to evade such apprehension by means of providing him shelter, food, drink, money, clothes, arms, ammunitions, means of conveyance, or he is assisting that person in the same kind or through other kinds that is enumerated in this section or not. All that help or aid that was done by such person to this person who is evading apprehension will be considered as harboring. Okay, but harboring by a wife or a husband, basically a spouse, will not be considered as harboring in true sense according to the Indian Penal Code. So if a person is harbored by his wife or husband, that means his spouse, then it will not be considered as harboring. So that's all in this video. If you like my videos, then don't forget to smash the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much for watching this video.